right now, I just had a little play of words, exercising modernity, exorcising modernity. That's very much what I am in the business of, to exercise modernity. Architecture of Perdition. It's actually a title of a book that I've never written, but maybe I will do it in the future. But of course, relating to my work on the German camps, especially in Poland. So here, a drawing made by my friend Mark Potwell, a New York-based artist, famous for his illustrations of the op-ed page in the New York Times. In some way, a summary of the issues we're dealing with. A German designed and constructed oven on Polish territory that holds the remains of Jewish civilization and Jewish life. So I would like to start with glad to see that when in the early 1990s, his legacy was still very much suppressed, also in Auschwitz, in the Auschwitz Museum, that has changed in Poland. And so here we have Pilecki as an Auschwitz inmate. And here a corner of an exhibition that I installed 2 years ago in New York City. It is the exhibition Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. And he is one of the characters, one of the subjects of our exhibition in a room on resistance and persistence. And I will just show you here the building in which the exhibition is still on show. The Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's on the southern tip of Manhattan. You see the World Trade Center, or the Freedom Tower as it's called, just north of it, and then just south of it is the Statue of Liberty. And I will just introduce the exhibition to you because it allows me to frame a little bit also my narrative. So here we have one of the first rooms, basically showing a wheel set of a German freight locomotive, symbolizing in some way the perpetrators, a lady's shoe from Auschwitz, and then 3 original posts, concrete posts from the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, installed with a photo of that camp behind it, with also original barbed wire from Auschwitz to introduce basically the history of the camp. It's an exhibition that very much is shaped by my work on the history of Auschwitz that I did in the early 1990s or the late 80s even, in which I got very interested actually in the location of the town of Oswiecim, of Auschwitz as it was called in German, long before the Second World War, for most of its history, a border town between Poland and the German lands, or then between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany in 1900, as it's shown right here. And so again, we have here a map of the invasion of Poland in 1939, a German illustration from a contemporary history book published in 1940, and where the big round reddish dot near Katowice and Krakow in the bottom centers on the location of Oswiecim at the time, as you see, very close to the then border between Germany and Poland. Important to remember that when Germany annexed in October 1939 Western Poland, which was called the New East, the Neue Osten, that in fact in the area that it annexed in Upper Silesia, the town of Oswiecim became officially part of the German Reich, like Katowice and also, of course, Lodz, Litzmannstadt, Łódź, but Krakow became the capital of the General Gouvernement. And so Auschwitz becomes a German town now. Here we became part of the Kreis Bilitz, of the district of Bilitz, a German town, and we have here a road sign basically to mark the boundary of that town, created in 1940, a road sign we have in the exhibition. An existing a military base that had been created as a border crossing dormitory facility in 1917, which had become a Polish military base in 1920, was then in 1940 adapted to become a German concentration camp to basically terrorize the local Polish population that could not be deported because development around basically the industrial heart of Upper Silesia, and one of the towns that is singled out for new development is Auschwitz. So in 1940, when German industrial and economic planners and regional planners were looking at Auschwitz, they looked at a place that they basically considered for industrial investment. Most importantly, the creation of the largest synthetic rubber and synthetic gasoline factory in Europe. Here we have a German school plate showing basically the two sources of rubber in 1940, either natural rubber, which of course was unavailable to Germany because it was produced in Malaya at the time, and that was British territory, or artificial synthetic rubber that could be made out of coal, out of lime and water. And of course, in Upper Silesia, there are all the coal mines. There were large lime deposits actually adjacent to the town of Auschwitz. And there were three rivers coming together, the Weichsel-Vistula River, the Zola River, and the third river. There was a great amount of water at that location, so an ideal location for a synthetic rubber plant. It was that investment that came with the synthetic rubber plant that also allowed for the planning of a new city of Auschwitz, a city for 65,000 people that was going basically to house all of the workers of the plant. And here we see one of the designs created in 1941 for the new railway station in the city. Basically, German planners created a full set of plans to create this new city that was going to provide German workers with what were considered minimal German standards of comfort and aesthetic enjoyment. So in order to develop this area, the Germans needed more than a simple concentration camp to provide forced and slave labor. And so in 1941, the decision was taken in Berlin to concentrate over 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war in the Auschwitz area to create a second large camp on the west side of the railway corridor. The old camp, the existing camp, was on the right side of the corridor in a suburb called Zazole, but near the village of Brzezinska or Birkenau, a large camp was going to be built to house Soviet POWs who were going to be put to work to create that new city of Auschwitz. Here we have the original design from 1941 for the gate of this camp, the Kriegsgefangenenlager, KGL, which means prisoner of war camps. So this part of the Auschwitz concentration camp was not to be basically filled with Polish inmates, but with Soviet POWs. And of course, this is the first version of the gate that will become known as the Gate of Death, which will be extended in 1943 also to the right side, to the north side, to become a more symmetrical gate. This gate was designed in the architecture office that was established in the camp. Here we have a photo of basically the room of the chief architect, Karl Bischoff. We see some of the drawings on the board, and behind this room, through the glass wall, you can actually see the design department. And again, we see the German architects and engineers here all in meetings. We have here a photo of the architects and engineers that were at work in Auschwitz, basically from middle of 1941 onwards. And it was a relatively large staff because there was a lot of construction going on. The man in the center, the middle-aged man, is a German architect who comes from Saarland, Karl Bischoff, who was the head of the Zentralbauleitung, the Central Construction Office, with to his left, and that is for our right then, the man who looks slightly away from the camera, his name is Walter de Jaco, an architect from Reutte in Tyrol, who was his chief designer. And we will learn more about Walter de Jaco. Very important in this picture is also the man here in the center of the picture, who's looking straight in the camera, Fritz Ertol. Fritz Ertol was in some way the chief urbanist on the team. He was an important designer in the early phases of the design of Birkenau. And what makes Fritz Ertol very interesting to many people today is that he was a graduate of the Bauhaus. So here we have one of the plans that is developed by Ertol under oversight of Bischoff. It is a plan for the standard brick barracks to be built in this new Soviet prisoner of war camp at Birkenau. And this basically is a plan for stables, for chicken coops for human beings. In no way do they actually meet any of the requirements for the housing of POWs, prisoners of war, which are, of course, articulated in the Geneva Convention. They should have the same amount of space as German soldiers would be given when on a military base. Now, this is less than a tenth per person. And what makes this drawing very interesting is that there is actually, when we're looking at the capacity, we see that it says it is a dwelling barrack, an Unterkunftsbarack, a dormitory, für ein Gefangenenlager, for a prisoner of war camp, Fassungsvermögen, that means capacity, and originally says around 550 men, but then we see that in a pencil, this is changed to 748, and there is a little annotation at the bottom of that in the handwriting of Karl Bischoff, the chief architect, in which he basically decides to put on each platform, there's 3 platforms on top of each other, each measuring 2 by 2 meters, instead of 3 inmates, 4 inmates, which basically increases the capacity of each barrack by a third. And so this is very important because, again, we see here actually forensically a war crime, literally a war crime, because POWs are protected by the laws of war. We see a war crime in the making, an architectural war crime. And so this is then Karl Bischoff before he joined the SS. He died in 1948. After the war, after returning to Saarbrücken, he was never held accountable for any of the work he did in Auschwitz. So these are these barracks as they were. This photo was taken in 2003. Right now, they are in a much worse condition. And the reason is that there are a lot of earthquakes, small earthquakes in this region because of the mines, the destabilization of the soil of mines. The closest mine is around 2 kilometers away from the site. They were very hastily constructed at the time itself with recycled bricks from the farmhouses of Birkenau that we are being destroyed in order to make way of the camp. Many of you probably will have seen this barracks, but this is the interior. And you must imagine now that the effect of Bischoff's decision was that on each of these platforms, 3 again in a row, 3 instead of 3, 4 people would have to basically live. That was the only space allowed for them. It's more or less the space of a large coffin for each person. Because of the lack of bricks, ultimately in Birkenau, the majority of the barracks that were constructed were not of this brick kind, but these were these prefabricated horse stables, which were produced by a German company in Niesky, which is near Görlitz, of course now a border town between Germany and Poland, produced by a quite famous company, Christoph and Urmach, and these became the kind of standard barrack in Birkenau, constructed from 1942 onwards. And here we have a wartime photo taken from one of the guard towers at the perimeter of Birkenau in the winter of 42 1943. So the story of Birkenau, of course, is well known, that after the first 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war have arrived, and most of them die basically constructing the camp, or are murdered constructing the camp in 1942 ceases to be a destination for Soviet POWs, and it becomes a destiny for Jews from all over Europe. It becomes one of the key sites in what we now know as the Holocaust. And basically, so in some way there is a change in the purpose and function of this camp. You see behind here, it's a photo from 1944 of a selection taking place on the Rampe, that infamous gate of which I showed the design before. So we now continue the exhibition. I show here the place of selection where we were lent by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, which, by the way, made 750 artifacts available to us, a pair of SS boots. So the visitor basically approaches the pair of SS boots, and we have a quote here of a young girl who survived selection because she was a twin to be abused by Dr. Mengele in Dr. Mengele's experiments, who talked about the boots, that she was small, and she particularly saw of the doctor who was selecting his shiny boots. And of course, many survivors always talk about that. So here we have an air photo taken in 1944 of the Auschwitz area. It shows at the center Auschwitz city. Then we show the main camp. We see in white the railway lines. It was, of course, an old border town, and it was a meeting point of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German railways before 1914. We see the IG Farben site, the synthetic rubber factory, with the Auschwitz-Monowitz camp to the right, and Auschwitz-Birkenau to the left. And so these are the main pieces of what is the Auschwitz camp at that location. There are 40 satellite camps elsewhere in Upper Silesia. So again, take you through the exhibition. After the selection, there is a big room that shows a large model of Birkenau. It also shows the places of origins of most of the inmates in Auschwitz. And you see that that map shows that, in fact, Auschwitz was different from Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, because a great number of its victims actually came from Western and Southern and Southeastern Europe, while of course Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were primarily basically devoted to the murder of Polish Jews. This raises then the whole issue of the design of the crematoria. We show here this plan of first basically a sketch of the basement of the crematoria in Auschwitz. 4 are built, 2 of a larger type, 2 of a smaller type. This is the larger type, which we then show also by means of models. We are looking here at the gas chamber at the left front, and then we have the incineration rooms at the back. They're connected by an elevator. It was an underground gas chamber that originally was a morgue before this building was adapted into a factory of murder. Drawings here by David Oller, a survivor of the Sonderkommandos from 1946, of the undressing room. He had a photographic memory, so this is quite a credible representation of what happened in these places. Then we come back in the exhibition, the room dedicated to the factory of murder, little children's shoe with a sock still tucked in it, which is very important, one of the key artifacts in our exhibition. Then a reconstruction of a gas door found in 1945 at the Auschwitz site by Russian investigators, since then disappeared, but reconstructed on the basis of photos. And behind it, a gas column that will become basically the key piece in my story. But we will just finish the exhibition and show you again an image by David Oller of the elevator in the back, the corpse elevator, bringing the corpses from the underground gas chambers into the incineration room. And then his image of the chimneys bellowing out the smoke and ashes as a next transport arrives. Again, it is absolutely amazing. This is from 1945. He had a photographic memory. These images are all produced, these drawings, in Paris when he returns there, before any photos are available of these buildings, which, by the way, were, of course, destroyed before the Germans left the camp in 1945. An original barrack from Auschwitz-Monowitz then centers the exhibition on life in the camp itself. And then from there we come to the room where we started, the room that is on persistence and resistance, with as our key object a talit katan worn by an inmate in Auschwitz, at the risk of his life, of course, every day, in obedience to the commandments. And then in the left corner, we introduce again Witold Pilecki and his story of bringing out the story of this camp in 1943 after his escape. And just here some statistics. The importance of Auschwitz in the Holocaust. It has the largest number of victims, a single place. Of course, Treblinka is a good runner-up, but this basically shows you, where the 6 million Jews were murdered, and then also about Auschwitz itself, a graphic that shows the largest victim groups. 1.1 million Jews transported to Auschwitz, of which 90% do not leave the camp alive, only around 100,000 Jews, then around 150,000 non-Jewish Poles, of which around half survives. Of the Roma, around 25,000, only 2 or 3,000 survive. Soviet POWs, 15,000, almost all are murdered, and then around 25,000 others. So you see in this graphic also very clearly that the highest survival rate were amongst non-Jewish Poles, and the lowest survival rates around Soviet POWs, and then Jews and the Roma. So today, the gas chamber of both Crematorium 2 and 3, these buildings with the underground gas chambers, are ruins. They are extremely important places, I think, in the geography of genocide and the geography of the world. In this particular room, the gas chamber of Crematorium 2, according to my calculation, around 250,000 people were murdered, which makes it the most deadly single place on Earth. In 1945, after the liberation of this part of Poland, first a Soviet forensic investigation took place, and from May 1945, when the Red Army moved, a Polish team did the investigation. It was led by a judge, investigating judge from Krakow, Dr. Jan Zane. We see him here in the center. He's wearing the striped tie. He is here at the entrance to the underground undressing room of Crematorium 2, an extremely capable investigator, forensic investigator, together with Professor Roman Dawidowski, the man to the right with the beret, who basically analyzed the buildings also from an architectural forensic point of view. And still, the very basis of our knowledge of what happened in the camp really is based on the report by Zane and Dawidowski, published in 1946. The investigators found remains of the gas chambers, most importantly this gas door, which we reconstructed in our exhibition. This is the so-called perpetrator side, and on the other side, the victim side, with very importantly the peephole that was protected, that had this steel mesh over the glass in order to protect the glass from being broken by the people in the gas chamber as the gas came in. And there are basically testimonies that this indeed happened. And so this door disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore, probably stolen by somebody who needed some good lumber. But we are very much dependent on our knowledge of the construction of the gas chambers by eyewitness testimony. The most important one by this surviving Sonderkommando. His name is Tauber, and he gave to Jan Zane in May 1945 a very, very detailed account of both the operation of the gas chambers of Crematoria 2 and 3, but also of their design. By the way, this is a photo of him before the Holocaust. And on the basis of Tauber's testimony, a draftsman of Professor Davidovsky made this drawing in 1945 that showed the underground arrangement of the crematorium number 2 with the large undressing room. You see also the entry. This is the entry to the left, where the photo was taken of Dr. Zane and Professor Davidovsky in 1945. And then from the undressing room, one would come into the gas chamber. And it shows here 4 introduction devices for the gas. And I will be focusing on those right now. And you see also a number of columns, both in the undressing room and the gas chamber, that basically support a beam that supports the slab that is the roof. So this is a reconstruction that drawn by a student of mine in the 1990s of the gas chamber of Crematorium 2. So you see that beam in the center of the gas chamber. You see the structural columns, 7 structural columns, concrete columns. And to the left and to the right of the structural columns, we see these gas introduction devices that were described by Tauber. And these are, but it was very difficult to understand exactly how they operated. We also see, by the way, the ventilation systems in the walls, one at the bottom and one at the angled piece at the top, to basically bring in fresh air into this room and to suck out the gas after the gassing. And we see also the fake shower heads attached to the ceiling. Now, the reason that these columns existed was because the Zyklon that was being used in this to murder the Jews had been developed as an insecticide. They came in a crystallized form in a tin. And basically what happened was, when you open the tin, the cyanide that is basically in these crystals starts evaporating. And they evaporate for 24 hours to create, in places that need to be deloused, especially large grain storage facilities, a continuous stream of cyanide. Because the problem in killing lice and other vermin is not killing the animals, but destroying the eggs, the nits. And that demands a longer exposure to the cyanide. So the key piece of the patent was this 24-hour basically degassing process. But when you are murdering human beings, they basically, certainly at the doses used in Auschwitz, everyone will have been killed after 15 minutes. So after those 15 minutes, you want to be able to get access to the gas chamber as quickly as possible, because the next day another transport is coming. You do not want to wait 24 hours for the degassing to stop. So what the SS architects in Auschwitz developed was a contraption in which which allowed the SS to fill a kind of pipe or some kind of basket with the cyanide material, standing on top of the roof in the open air, open a hatch, and then lower the cyanide into the center of this column. That was a wire mesh column. The cyanide would degas from that central kind of holder into the gas chamber. And when everyone was murdered after 15 minutes, you could hoist the still degassing cyclone out of the room, turn on the ventilators, and you see the ventilator shafts basically to the right and the left against the ceiling and against the floor. And then the cyanide would continue to degas for 24 hours on the roof. It wouldn't hurt the SS at all. And you could then, after ventilating the room for half an hour, open the door and start taking out the corpses. This contraption, according to me, was designed by Walter de Jaco, the chief designer in Auschwitz. Only 8 of these contraptions were created ever, 4 for Crematorium 2 and 4 for Crematorium 3. And I credit this particular piece of design with what basically I would consider it as a smoking gun in many ways for the purposefully design of Auschwitz as a place of genocide. There's no other explanation for it. And also to be the nadir of the architectural profession in its 6,000-year history. It is the worst thing that an architect ever did. Now, these gas columns were removed in late 1944. When gassing stopped, they were put on a train and they disappeared. They might be sitting in that same train with all the gold that is rumored to be somewhere under a mountain in Silesia today. I would love to see one of these things discovered. They were actually sent to Mauthausen, but they never arrived there. And so this is right now the roof of Crematorium 2 after the gas columns were removed. The SS dynamited the structural columns, and with 6 of the 7 in Crematorium 2 collapsed. 1 of them didn't, and so the roof pancaked in some way on top of it. It was destroyed. In the 1970s, Holocaust deniers started to basically a public campaign in which they denied the Holocaust by denying the murders in Auschwitz. They basically argued that if you can create doubt about the murders in Auschwitz, you can create doubt about the Holocaust in general because of the central location of Auschwitz in the narrative about the Holocaust. A major denier who became very influential is the late Ernst Zundel, a German citizen living actually in Canada, in Toronto, not far from where I'm speaking right now. And he became the major propagandist for the thesis that basically Auschwitz is a hoax. Until 1989, they were never able to convince a historian of the legitimacy of their position. So if you're revising history and you don't have any historian to believe you, you have something of a problem. But in 1989, a British historian, David Irving, who already had been kind of a soft-core denier by saying that, yes, the Holocaust happened, but Hitler didn't know about it. It happened behind his back by evil Mr. Himmler and evil Mr. Goebbels. Basically, for reasons of his own, and they're too complex to go into that, decided to convert from soft-core denial, that is, yes, it happened, but it was a rogue operation, into hardcore denial by saying it was all a hoax created by Jews to swindle the Germans out of Deutschmarks and the Palestinians out of a homeland. This was an incredible achievement for Holocaust deniers because now they had a historian on their side, a very well-published man who had written many books about the Second World War. And the pivot that made Irving decide to join this cause was a report written by this man, Fred Leuchter, an engineer in the United States who had a business in servicing and repairing execution equipment. This basically, at that time, was a recognized profession. He was an engineer specializing in that. He had to basically certify the quote-unquote safety of execution equipment of the state's prisons, because of course the U.S. still has a death penalty, and before you have an execution, it needs to be certified to be safe, whatever that means. Certainly not, of course, for the inmate who's going to die. And so he had a standing in the courts, and Zundel got the idea when he was in a Canadian court, accused of Holocaust denial, to send this engineer who had a standing in the field to Auschwitz to write a forensic report on the gas chambers. And he came back and presented his report, the Leuchter report, after being 2 days in Auschwitz and saying that the gas chambers could never have worked. And it was that report that basically made Irving into a Holocaust denier. Because of his standing as a well-respected author on books on the Second World War, Irving's conversion was seen by many deniers, but also by non-deniers, as an important moment in the history of Holocaust denial. And a historian, American historian named Deborah Lipstadt, who had been commissioned to write a book on Holocaust denial, made him into one of the central characters in the book that she published in 1993, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. And basically, she identified Irving because of his standing in the field as a liar, as a falsifier of history, as a very dangerous denier. And when Irving, as a result of that, started to lose income, when publishers didn't want to publish his books anymore, he decided to sue Lipstadt in a British court for libel, in which the burden of proof is on the defendant. And so here we see Irving in 1999, shortly before the proceedings begin. You see all of the binders of all of the documentation in the case. The bookcase goes on and on and on. The red binders produced by one law firm that also engaged me as an expert witness, Mishkondaraya, the blue ones by a second law firm. And behind him, you see a photo, an aerial photo of the roof of the gas chamber of Crematorium 2. And this became key, this particular roof, this particular site of gas chamber of Crematorium number 2 became very important in his case and in our defense. And I was called in because I knew something about this. So let's look now at a blueprint for Crematorium number 2. You see the plan with the central incineration room. You see the chimney there sitting in a kind of little appendix. You see the section to the top left. And you see how important the chimney is in there. But I'm going to focus on the two basement rooms, so semi-basements that are in the top right. So the left one is morgue number 1, Leichenkeller number 1, and number 2, the right one is number 2. The number 2 becomes the undressing room. Number 1, that becomes the gas chamber. And you see there already, you see its relationship to the drawing by my student that I showed. But if we're now looking at greater detail at Leichenkeller number 1, you see that there are no gas columns. We actually have not a single drawing from either the Auschwitz-Birkenau archive or the archive in Russia, which also has original materials for the construction of the camp, that actually shows these gas columns. And so this is for the deniers to say these gas columns never existed. There was no way to get this Zyklon into the room. Basically, there are no holes in the ceiling, the holes through which that Zyklon would have been lowered into those gas columns. Now, my argument is that these gas columns were only introduced later in the design because originally this room was designed as a morgue and not as a gas chamber. And so it was only when the function of the camp changed from being a Soviet POW camp to being a place for the arrival of Jews and the murder of Jews that the morgue was adapted into a gas chamber. But when we look here at the construction drawing created in 1942 for the excavation of the basement, and we are now looking at actually the structural columns in the center of what becomes the gas chamber, we see again that there is no indication of these gas columns that were placed to the left and the right of the central beam connecting to the open air above. And so this is for Holocaust deniers basically a way to say these things never existed if you cannot show me a drawing that shows those gas columns. Now there is evidence, by the way, that these existed. So we need to put the evidence together. It is circumstantial evidence. Here we have a photo from early 1943. You see the crematorium to the right of the little chimney of the engine. You see actually on top of the gas chamber, which has not been buried yet by dirt, we see actually a number of, it seems to be like boxes, but they're actually the tops of those gas columns. They're visible at that time. Then we have the testimony by Tauber. We have also drawn testimony here, self-portrait of a young man, Yehuda Bakon, who was an inmate of Auschwitz, came there in the Czech family camp in 1943, then ultimately became part of a commando of boys that had to bring documents to the crematorium to be burnt, and saw the gas chamber. He was actually allowed to warm up in the gas chamber in the middle of the winter when it wasn't used because it was a warm space. 1945 in Mauthausen, immediately after his liberation, he draws this picture of the crematorium that he had seen, and he also shows to the left top, you see actually the top of the gas chamber with 4 introduction devices. So a piece of evidence that was only introduced, only discovered in 1961 during the Eichmann trial, and a second drawing now preserved in the Jerusalem Court Archive, also drawn in 1945 in Mauthausen, of a gas column. And you also see actually the lights. You see actually that strange angle that was created in the top of the gas chamber by the ventilation system. And he even draws the shower heads. So he shows a transparent column, a wire mesh column. And he also testified about this. Basically, he explained this drawing during the Eichmann trial in great detail. So important visual evidence, also evidence here by David Olaire. This is a self-portrait he creates in after the war of him as he was working in the gas chambers when he had to basically clear out the gas chambers. But he draws in 1945, he draws his section of crematorium number 3, which is the mirror image of number 2. And what you see here is basically the gas columns, number E. He calls it grille pour bombe à gaz. So it is a wire mesh structure that he shows. And so again, visual evidence, eyewitness testimony, of course, but now drawn. You see above it the incineration room. Of course, the gas chamber is not right under the incineration room because it's simply the foundations, these ovens are too heavy for that. And here we see another drawing from 1945, where he draws the plan of crematorium number 3, but really in his numbering it's 2. It's a mirror image of number 2, which is in his counting number 1. You see the gas chamber, and you see at number 10, what you see here are the introduction devices, and they are in a zigzag pattern. Now, it's very important that they're in a zigzag pattern because when we look at aerial photos taken in 1944, we also see that of that space, that there are these spots in the photo of something in a zigzag pattern. So we see a convergence of evidence between eyewitness testimony drawn in 1945 and American air photos taken in 1944 and only basically made available to the public in 1979. So converging evidence that indeed there were those holes in the roof, that there was these gas columns below the holes. The deniers continue to say, no holes, no Holocaust. Professor van Pelt, if you cannot show me the holes, you cannot prove of these Auschwitz crematoria, you cannot prove that the Holocaust ever existed. So this led then to analysis in 1999 and the year 2000 at the time of the trial by my friend, by friends from mine, both in Israel and also in Mexico and the United States, of this roof. Harry Mazal was the leader of that. He financed everything. He sadly died a few years ago. But what actually happened to the roof when the explosion happened? And Harry Mazal used to be an explosion specialist. And so the way it basically literally was thrown upside down, and this led then to an analysis of the rubble that is now the roof. And we were able to indicate the places of the holes in, basically because everything is a hole right now, by identifying the rebars. So you see the rebars here circled by the yellow circles, because when you create a hole in a concrete roof, you have to interrupt the rebars. This is before the concrete is poured and the rebars are bent back. And this is a telltale sign in the rubble of this roof that indeed those holes were not made during the explosion, but in fact we're looking here at one that was created during construction of the roof, which then led us to identify those 4 holes in the now destroyed roof of Crematorium number 2. And that ultimately then also became a major point of debate and of evidence, presenting evidence during the trial itself, which ultimately, of course, ended up for Irving very badly, because the defense succeeded in its offense, and basically he was his libel suit failed. So very famous trial in 2000, the verdict was seen as a major blow to Holocaust denial. It's very important that in the verdict there are 25 pages on Auschwitz, ultimately a judge's report on my evidence, which basically said that the evidence for the genocidal design and operation of the crematoria was overwhelming. Now, I've always been interested by those gas columns. Here we have and of course, because I teach architecture, I'm really interested in columns. Here we have a very famous colonnade in Munich, created for the Haus der Kunst, the Haus der Deutschen Kunst originally, on a stamp from 1936. The Nazi architects loved their columns. And this is the first drawing that I commissioned from a student named Andrew Ortwine in 1987, when I started working on this topic. And so it's an attempt to interpret the Haus der Kunst today as basically that hidden in this monumental architecture, we already have basically the camps. You see here actually the design by Bischoff and Ertol of the barrack, the abstracted design, and then we see the crematoria ovens abstracted, and behind there you see the five columns of a gas chamber. And in some way it was a conceptual attempt to represent the relationship between gas chambers and Nazi architecture in its most monumental form. It was really a single thing. Now, importantly, I have sent this to the curator at the Haus der Kunst some time ago and actually proposed an exhibition there, but they never responded. I think that they seem to be unwilling to deal with this particular association of their building with the Holocaust. I think they love to have modern art exhibitions there, but for God's sake, do not make too direct a connection. Columns are very important in architecture. As we know, the Greeks developed the idea of using columns as a piece of the body to create a sense of architecture as a body, not simply anymore being in a closed box, making architecture alive, and of course most perfectly embodied in the Parthenon, but it's actually the columns that give that life, that vitality to buildings. Columns, of course, are ultimately about the basic problem of supporting loads of gravity, and gravity, of course, is the major issue that architects always have to deal with. Columns also are important markers in our urban landscape, in our mental landscape, in our historical landscape, and of course columns going back to the story of Samson in Gaza. You know, that's what you attack when you actually attack the buildings. You know, then in some way the building will kill the people inside. And of course, this was the typical way that buildings would kill people. This is why you have building codes until Walter de Jaco developed the gas chamber. Now, when I over time, I have redrawn these columns. And so this is the mid-1990s. And you see, we're kind of vague in the way the column is constructed. I mean, we do not want to give any details in this drawing of the wire mesh. But when in 2002, I decided to publish my involvement in the trial in this book, The Case for Auschwitz, Evidence from the Irving Trial, a book, by the way, that got an award for the worst title of the year. What happened was that I needed to revisit for the illustrations, the design of this gas column. So my first reconstruction was this one. I did this with a student named Scott Parker. But ultimately, for the publication of the book, we ended up with a more robust version. And the reason for the robust version is that we were actually going back to why the column existed. It existed to allow for the unimpeded entry of Zyklon and the removal of Zyklon into that central bit of the column. And it needed to have that cage around it to basically protect it from the pressure of 2,000 bodies in that room. And so as we were basically redesigning that column for this publication, we decided to beef up that outer cage to make it stronger. And we were in discussion with engineers at the time. I teach, I'm in the faculty of engineering, people from the engineering department to basically see how large that outside cage should be to allow to basically protect that inner piece. I gave a copy of that book to Alejandro Aravena when he visited my school in 2007. And in 2015, he was elected to become the curator of the 2016 Venice Biennale. And he sent me an invitation to create a room in the central pavilion that would center on basically the forensic evidence that I'd given in the trial. And the whole Biennale was really about human rights issues and architecture and so on. So he believed that this forensic work worked well. So the first thing you had to do was create a proposal, and on one A4 piece of paper, which I did, for something that we called the evidence room, which ended up one single space we have. Mostly spaces are shared. We got one space in the International Pavilion in the Giardini, and the space is indicated here in red. So I did my PhD with a very famous scholar of the Renaissance, Dame Frances Yates, and of course her famous book is The Art of Memory. She was interested in Renaissance and medieval memory theaters. The most famous one was created in the 16th century in Venice. And in some way, because we were going to Venice, I wanted to create a kind of memory theater of Auschwitz, of the crematoria. And also what I wanted to do in addition was to refer to the evidence rooms that exist in police precincts. When crimes have been committed, they collect evidence, and that is then put in sealed boxes until that evidence needs to be accessed in trials. I developed this concept and this room with two colleagues, Donald Mackay, who became the chief designer of this room. I was basically the fundraiser, the historian, and the kind of general chair of the group. Donald, a very good designer, Canadian designer, who took basically charge, and he's here in Venice, took charge of basically the nitty-gritty of this room. And the idea was that we would have the three major elements of the gas chambers that had been contested in the trial: the gas door, the gas column, and then of another crematorium, a gas hatch, crematorium 4 and 5, the one you see to the right. I will not talk about that. Then to basically cover the walls with plaster, replicas of drawings and letters and minutes of meetings introduced to the trial as evidence, and combine everything in a room. And so I was able to raise $500,000 in a very short time to actually finance this whole operation, while Donald was drawing basically this installation. You see here the plan. The costs were going to be carried by a matrix, a steel matrix. But here we see the elevation with a steel matrix in this room. And here we see Donald's first reconstruction of the gas column. So he worked with the reconstruction Scott Barker had made in 2002 for the book, The Case for Auschwitz, but Donald started modifying it somewhat according to his best engineering insight. And also, in some way he had to start to channel the designer, Walter de Jaco, which was a somewhat difficult process, he certainly admitted to. So we have detailed designs now of this gas column, also working with what is available, for example, in steel mesh, in Canadian supply stores, in building supply stores. And so for the first time now, we got a very detailed design of these gas columns. Then the question was who was going to make it. And one of my students, Michael Nugent, actually his family comes from Lithuania. So those of you in Poland, you will recognize maybe a brother here. Michael Nugent was trained as a blacksmith, and so he volunteered to make the gas column. And he had a friend of his father's an engineer, and his father got involved, Tom Nugent, and they had a friend who had a metal workshop. And so Michael now started also to, in some way, channel not only Walter de Jaco, but of course the prisoners in the camp metal store that had created the gas column. And it was, of course, it was a kind of conversation between de Jaco and the prisoner, and started making this gas column. But he and his father, and working with the materials available, and also with the person who owned the metal workshop, and who was very interested in metal engineering from the 1940s in the United States, what they decided that actually, as they were making it, they were changing this gas column, because now they had to make it. And so in some way they said, okay, Donald Mackay, what you've designed is it seems to make sense, but if we're going to work this in detail, we basically are making modifications. So now we got a quite intense discussion between Michael, his father Tom, and Donald, which ended up that the gas column somewhat changed, as you see it in the left one is the one Donald designed, a somewhat more robust type even that was ultimately constructed. And in fact, two were constructed. In the meantime, my other colleague, Anne Bordelot, who has a practice in casting, started to develop ways, casting, of course, very important in the practice of preserving evidence, forensic casting, here basically evidence of maybe a break-in or evidence of a murder, the casting of the portraits of people who have died, making death masks. And of course, this is always used also traditionally in murder investigations. She started to find ways to cast actually the evidence. How do you do that? How do you create out of a photo, which is two-dimensional, a cast? So many trials were created, and ultimately we ended with a way of, for example, representing photos that in some way allows you to discover. It is not immediately clear what you see, but if you move in front of the cast, see it under different angles of light, you're forced really to move a lot to basically get the information that's in the thing. Ultimately, you can decipher it. And so we got around 80 casts of important pieces of evidence. Here, a photo of the architects that ultimately were going to make the walls of this evidence room. Here we have the section by Olaire, and here we have the cast. And we're very close to the end of my talk right now. So at Waterloo, we had a team of students making the cast when we finally had a way of doing this. And by March 30, 2016, we had 12 large crates that basically contained the casts and also the pieces of the gas column and the door, loaded on a wintry day in Canada to be shipped to Venice. You see Michael Nugent with the teal t-shirt to the left, and Bordelot is right standing to his left. Then the arrival in Venice. The team comes to install it. Michael Nugent is the third from the left. They had a great time. The installation of the matrix, unloading the casts. All of them were intact, which is really remarkable. So both Michael and Piper Birnbaum, who was the project manager, a student also, very happy. You see the room right in the back. Touching up the gas column just before the opening. Last inspection by Donald. The photo, every minute we had a photo taken of the team making it. We've just basically cleaned the floor, and the next photo will be the completed room. And it was, for me, when the lights went on, when this room basically was ready, an incredibly important moment. because my first impression was that I was actually in the mind of Walter de Jaco. This was an image that was part of my dissertation, and I felt literally I was in his mind. I was in that moment before he conceived of the gas column, which again, as I say, is the worst thing ever designed by an architect. So the evidence room was in Venice, then it has been at various other places. In Toronto, it was up for 2 years. Here we have an extra anteroom showing also a model of the crematorium. This is the looking back to the entrance. You see the gas column in detail now. You see the gas door with 2 sides are separated, the perpetrator side and the inmate side, because of course they are separated by a universe. And here a somewhat ghostly picture of that room. And it's been since then at the Hirshhorn Museum at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It was going to be installed in another museum, and then COVID happened, and that room has been in limbo ever since. So here, a final shot, looking inside the gas column. That is that basket, and we have there little pebbles in it, representing the cyclone, basically, that would have been lowered into this column. And so here, a final drawing by created by my friend Mark Potwell. I showed you at the beginning a drawing. This is basically a drawing for a book we have just finished together. We hope that it will be out in a few months. How do you represent the gas chamber? You know, it is one of the great problems, you know, the second commandment, you know, you should not make an image of a god. You shouldn't make an image of the gas chamber. I've always struggled with it. He represented it by depicting the gate of Auschwitz. We can depict that. Crematorium number 4, we can depict that. But what happens in between basically is beyond our ability to either draw or, for that matter, imagine. Thank you very much.